So my name is Ryan Hackwood. I have my PhD in chemistry, and I am CEO of Eternal Upcycling. We are a startup focused on scaling up and commercializing plastic upcycling technology to convert plastic waste into higher value chemical commodities and goods as a means of addressing the plastic waste crisis. So in high school, I wanted to be a video game designer. I really enjoyed video games and kind of the world that you can create through video game design. But towards the end of high school, I really developed a love for philosophy. I found being able to understand kind of humanity and our place within the natural world, kind of the inner machinations of what goes on, both as individuals interacting with nature and then individuals acting amongst each other in groups, really drove my fascination towards understanding kind of the principles and mechanisms of our world, which led to college, which led to undergrad, where I studied philosophy, political science, and economics. Philosophy being that main love, and political science and economics being kind of the means by which we can interact amongst ourselves and try to evaluate and determine what is important. Through those studies, I developed a much broader and deeper appreciation for those things, obviously. But I found that there was kind of a lacking in a deeper understanding of the natural world that encompasses all of those things. And so that's why I decided to tack onto that chemistry. And my love for chemistry happened to go at a much more rapid pace, I suppose, than say economics and politics, which then led me to apply to grad school for chemistry, then getting my PhD at Northwestern University, which then led to me getting a postdoc at Argonne National Lab, which led to the work that I do now. So I was born and raised in Washington State. So in the Pacific Northwest, we have a really deep and varied appreciation for the natural world around us. It's incredibly gorgeous over there. And part of that, at least when I was growing up, was centered around appreciation and respect for kind of the cultural institutions in that area. And part of that encompasses kind of the practices of the indigenous peoples in that area. And so growing up, it was quickly and easily established that as kind of a steward of the natural world in the area that you live in, you need to undertake certain practices in order to maintain the natural world, the environment, and kind of the pristine beauty that you live in. So that was something that I think for most people growing up in that area, it's pretty well known. And at the same time, growing up at least, I had to reconcile that with other practices, other institutions set in place by virtue of modernity, by virtue of kind of the ease in modern life that we've become accustomed to. So for example, that includes petrochemicals. So petrochemicals as a chemical good are incredibly useful and incredibly varied, and they encompass a wide range of goods and materials that make our lives a lot easier. In order to do that, there are a couple of practices and infrastructure schemes set in place in order to utilize petrochemical goods. And so when I was growing up, one of those examples was a pipeline. And when I was about 8 or 9, unfortunately, one of those pipelines running through my hometown exploded, which led to a great tragedy. A few people had died and devastated the town around that immediate area when I grew up in. And at the time, as a child, I didn't really understand the utility of that pipeline. I didn't understand kind of what it was used for, kind of what were the ramifications of having this type of material funneled through our hometown in such a great amount and what its useful properties were. I just knew that the tragedy was vast and not something that we obviously took lightly. It was something that was incredibly tragic at the time. It was only years and years later through developing an understanding of chemistry, developing an understanding of kind of the material world around us and how we develop the kind of goods and materials that make our lives easier. Anything from cars, clothing, electronic devices, these sorts of things all use petrochemical goods and petrochemicals that go through things like pipelines, where I had to reconcile something that is useful, this modern commodity, with something so much more personal, much more tragic in those two times. And so I think having those components growing up led me to kind of approach sustainability in a much more granular way and have an appreciation for what needs to be done in order to recognize that while establishing and seeking more permanent sustainability measures. So chemical upcycling can broadly be defined as using a chemical process to convert one type of good or material into a higher value good or material. This is in contrast to, say, recycling measures, where you are taking a good or material and converting it into something of comparable value. So by saying upcycling instead of recycling, we are saying that we are going to create or add value into this material by changing it or processing the chemical structure of it. And so this is kind of the approach that we are taking with plastic waste. Instead of using the more traditional methods for recycling plastic waste into another plastic material, we are using a different method through chemistry and our understanding of chemistry to convert it into something different. The reason for this is that typical recycling measures typically add defects to the plastic feedstock, which makes them just a tiny bit worse than what they were originally used for. And if you do that every time you recycle material, it progressively gets worse and worse until you can no longer use that plastic material for its original application. So if the original application was, say, as a plastic bag for a trash can or something like that, there's only so many iterations it can go through before it's not as effective as a plastic bag as it once was. And so the work that I've conducted at Argonne while as a postdoc is about developing, synthesizing, and optimizing catalysts. These are materials that help the chemical upcycling process, this reaction by which we turn the chemical structure of this plastic into something else. These catalysts help move that process along in a much more energetically favorable manner. And so while I was a postdoc at Argonne, we looked through a variety of different types of catalysts, looked through a variety of different types of reaction conditions to get this whole scheme of from A to B, being from plastic waste to say something like a lubricant, a higher value commodity that we can use for a different purpose later on, making that conversion process from A to B as easy as possible. So that means at a lower temperature so that we don't have to put as much energy into the system. So it would be cheaper. As much of A to as much of B as possible. So that's making it as selective as possible. So we can convert as much as we can without wasting any of the plastic waste. And doing it as quick as possible, because if we can convert as much plastic waste as we possibly can in a short period of time, then that just makes this whole process much more feasible to implement on the scale that we would need to in order to make this whole process feasible, because we produce a lot of plastic material in the US and across the world. And so in order to effectively tackle it, we need a process that can go through as we are producing. My business partner and I have founded Eternal Upcycling. We are a fresh startup company that are looking to take the chemical technology that we have developed at Argonne National Lab and scale it up and actually implement it into industry to take this plastic waste and convert it into higher value goods and chemicals as a means of impacting sustainability and creating or help establish a circular carbon economy in the US. So going back to kind of what is going on for all of the materials and goods that we use as a society, a lot of it is centered around petrochemical goods. So if you can grab just about anything within a few feet of you, in some form or fashion, petrochemicals have been involved in the production of that material. Anything from your cell phone, your computer, your clothing, any kind of trinkets, writing materials, anything you can possibly think of, petrochemicals have been utilized in the production in some form or fashion for that material good. And as a consequence of that, a lot of petrochemicals are needed, and a lot of petrochemical derivatives are utilized for those actual materials and for the transportation of those materials. And so in order to help establish a circular carbon economy, not only do we have to look at the impact of those petrochemicals in the form of CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions, we also need to look at more sustainable means of those original petrochemicals themselves. And so one of those petrochemical applications is plastics. So polymers and plastics in general are produced from petrochemicals. And so if we can take the kind of hydrocarbon feedstock that is encapsulated in that plastic material and reuse it by simply changing the chemical structure a tiny bit, we can get another turn at that carbon material, that energy-rich, really dense material. And that allows us to, one, not allow for that plastic material to go into the environment to slowly degrade into microplastics, which have their own problems and their own toxicity concerns. But they also produce greenhouse gas emissions in and of themselves, either by wasting away in the environment, or as some applications go, for incineration purposes. So by diverting plastic waste away from the environment, away from landfills, away from incineration practices, we can take that carbon material, slightly tweak it, and then recirculate it back into the economy as a different type of material. So for the work that we're doing at Eternal Upcycling, for example, we are taking that plastic waste and converting it into lubricants. So lubricants are needed across all sorts of transportation applications. The most easily relatable one being motor oil. So for example, we can take something like plastic bags and convert it into the motor oil that would be put into your car, for example. But there are also greener applications for lubricants. So for example, a lot of lubricating material is needed for wind turbines. And so being able to develop green aligned or eco-friendly lubricants for wind turbines from, say, like plastic bags, that is something we are also looking to do.